And welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, new leadership for the UN as Ban-Kimoon prepares to step down. Questions of regional representation and gender could play a role in selecting his replacement. And world-class football. Chinese leadership has issued a long-term plan for the country's football league. Will China someday produce international contenders? And we begin today's show in New York. For the very first time in the organization's 70-year history, the world will hear from the candidates running to become the next UN Secretary General when Ban Ki-moon steps down at the end of this year. Candidates are offered a chance to present their bids at two public debates in New York and London, faced by representatives of 193 countries and civil society from around the world. The competition for the world's top diplomatic post has attracted much attention.
What would you do to make sure countries take action to stop catastrophic climate change?
How do you think about peacekeepers who are operating in conflict environments?
The Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
What you consider your most important achievement?
A chance to publicly pitch for the world's top diplomatic post. The 8 candidates here have to convince audiences that they're the most suitable choice to serve as the next UN Secretary General. They will be given 10 minutes each to defend their views and respond to questions from member states. The coverage of the selection process this year revolves around 2 themes. One is a push to have a woman be the next Secretary General, as half of the 8 candidates are women. Among them are Bulgaria's Irina Bokova, who is the Director General of UNESCO; Helen Clark, former Prime Minister of New Zealand and current head of the UN Development Programme; and the other 2 female candidates are Natalia Gurman, a Moldovan politician who was Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of European Integration, and Vesna Pusic, leader of the Liberal Croatian People's Party. She also served as the first Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign and European Affairs. The 4 male candidates are Antonio Guterres, former Prime Minister of Portugal and UN High Commissioner for Refugees; Srdjan Karim, Macedonian economist and diplomat. He served as Macedonia's foreign minister and was president of the 62nd session of the UN General Assembly; Danilo Turk, former president of Slovenia. He served as the UN Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs; and Igor Luksic, former Prime Minister of Montenegro and current Minister of Foreign Affairs. The other factor in this year's race is a belief among governments from Eastern Europe that it is their turn to nominate the next Secretary General, as the post has tended to rotate among regions. 6 of this year's 8 candidates are from Eastern Europe. This year's race is intended to display greater transparency, and the public hearings will likely influence the final decision.
Among the candidates for the UN Secretary General, there are 4 women. 2 of them already had the UN agencies and therefore have the knowledge of both being a political leader or diplomat representing an individual country and leading a UN organization. They are Helen Clark and Irina Bokova. During last year's General Assembly in New York, we already noted their possible intentions to run for the office of the UNSG. We featured both of them on our program's exclusives. Let's hear excerpts of those interviews for a better idea about who they are and what they stand for. Of course, we hope that we will also have the opportunity to talk to some of the other candidates for the UN General Secretary. For now, let's hear first from Helen Clark, former New Zealand Prime Minister and now Director General of the United Nations Development Programme. She told me about her expectations ahead of the race for the UNSG. Let's take a look.
I just hope it's a clean contest, that the member states reflect on what is it that we want of this new person. One of my friends in Asia said to me, "Remember, Helen, it's more secretary than general."
That's a great reminder, in fact.
It's a good reminder.
Make sure you know what you're competing for.
That's right.
But having said that, though, from your perspective, even though you are not representing the member countries, What kind of leadership do you think we really need now?
Well, we have had a series of wonderful Secretary Generals, and one of the main purposes which the UN was founded for was to stop wars between nations. By and large, wars between nations have stopped. I think the most serious challenge now, and for the next Secretary General, is to look at these other conflicts and the whole toolkit of the UN and the international community for dealing with them. These conflicts involve extremists, militias, ideologically fueled groups. They're conflicts largely within states, but they spill over national borders as well. I think the challenge is to find the whole toolkit to deal with this, and I know that development is one of those tools.
Yes, indeed. Development is exactly her topic. That's Helen Clark, a former Prime Minister of New Zealand and now Director General of UNDP, talking to me about the nature of her work and how that would be a plus for her in the race for the office of UN Secretary General. Compared to Clark, the current Director General of UNESCO, Irina Bokova, has more experience dealing with protection of cultural heritage worldwide. However, in an exclusive with us, Ms. Bokova argued that her work is not merely just about protecting cultural heritage, but rather dealing with all related issues, including global security. Let's listen to what she had to say last time I talked to her in New York during the General Assembly.
So what we have been mobilized recently is to stop this illicit activity. And we have the resolution of the Security Council, which was adopted, in fact, during the presidency of China in February this year, which on financing of extremism, recognizing this illicit trafficking and appealing to stop the looting and the destruction of heritage. I think it is important because it falls under Chapter 7 of the Charter of the United Nations. It speaks about threat to peace and security. It is not just a cultural concern that we have. We have it, indeed, but it is also a direct threat to peace and security. So this illicit trafficking, protecting the heritage and the culture is not just a cultural concern, it is a security imperative.
Well, that's an excerpt of our interview with Irina Bokova, a Bulgarian diplomat, currently heads UNESCO, one of the two UN agency heads competing for the top UN job as Secretary General. For more on the selection of the next UN Secretary General, we are now joined in the Beijing studio by Professor Liu Baocheng, who is the Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics at University of International Business and Economics. And meanwhile, joining us from New York, we are having Professor Jean Krasno, who is a lecturer at the City College of New York and also Columbia University. She also chairs the campaign to elect a woman UN Secretary General. Welcome to our program as well. Meanwhile, joining us from Boston, we are having Mr. Luis Costa-Ribas, who is a former managing editor at Voice of America. Welcome to the three of you. This is an interesting campaign we are seeing in front of us beginning from Tuesday. Unprecedented, I would have to say, Professor Krasno. You have already seen two of those women candidates talking to us earlier in an exclusive interviews. But what do you make of the possibility of their winning, especially women winning this time?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to join you. And China, of course, is a very important player as a permanent member of the Security Council in this whole selection process. Of course, they have the veto. So we have been working on this campaign to get a woman elected Secretary General after 70 years. With 8 men, it's time for a woman. And we're seeing, after meeting with member states and civil society, that there is really a groundswell of support for electing a woman this time around. So we're very confident in this.
Mr. Ribas, it is not just the gender, but also geography, it seems, that could be a topic for debate when it comes to where those the best candidates could be from. What is your opinion? Gender versus the region, should they be the priorities?
Well,
let's go to Mr. Ribas.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yeah, well, we'll have to see, because at the end of the day, even though there's more openness in this process, the selection is pretty much in the hands of the Security Council, and by that we mean the P5, the 5 permanent members. So a lot is going to be played out between now and the first straw poll in the Security Council in July. I'm not sure that the members of the Security Council, particularly the P5, are going to be so keen on a woman for the sake of a woman. I think if a woman is the best candidate, she will win. I think because she's the best candidate, not necessarily because she's a woman. Now, the geographical question is a little bit more tricky, because it's, you know, under the informal rules of the United Nations. Well, I wouldn't call it a rule, just a habit. This should be Europe's turn. But because of the rivalry between Russia and the United States, Eastern Europe is demanding a seat at the table. And Russia is promoting very much that, and that is seen in the Western countries certainly as a way to continue their confrontation with the United States diplomatically and politically, and certainly to weaken NATO and the European Union. We are not sure how this is going to play out. I think China will probably have a say in these, and China also has its disputes with the United States in the South China Sea. So I think the regional question, based on the specific interests of the P5, may end up carrying a lot more weight than whether or not the Secretary General is going to be a woman. And certainly this is going to be a big challenge.
Professor,
this triangle of interests between the U.S., China, and Russia, this is going to be a big challenge for the next Secretary General, regardless of whether or not it's a woman or a man.
Professor Liu, what do you think? Geopolitics?
Well, I think, you know, this is still big nation politics. Number one, of course, you know, there is a set rule that the P5 cannot really nominate their own people to be the Secretary in General, but normally, you know, it's from the small and medium-sized countries, but stay in a very neutral position. So the word neutrality is really left open for free interpretation, because that's the, after all, the UN Secretary position is a power rival occasion for such a selection.
It's interesting that all of you, the three of you, have been talking about the informal rules and what people look at as the possible rules. According to the UN Charter, I did really check out before coming into the studio, there's actually not that much specific description as to how a Secretary General should be selected. It is only very simple, as the Security Council should submit the name of the candidate, and it has to be approved by the General Assembly. As simple as that. And therefore, Professor Krasno, it leaves us a lot of space of imagination, and certainly a lot of space for debates as well. We understand, Professor Krasno, this is the very first time that you are going to see public hearings of all the 8 candidates on TV, on the web, also receiving questions from civil society, not just the UN members, but rather civil society and the general public through the internet about what they think of issues as they see important. So what is going to happen? Will public opinion eventually sway the weights of several candidates? Will it eventually, in a way, shape some of the debates that's going on, even at the UN Security Council?
Well, as you said, the Security Council will make the decision and then give that name to the General Assembly for a vote, and they have to have 2/3. So there is a process by which this works. And I think with the open hearings that we've been witnessing and the active, very proactive engagement of the General Assembly on this particular issue, the Security Council is going to have to listen because they can't afford to present a candidate and then have the General Assembly reject that candidate on the grounds that perhaps this person wasn't invited for a hearing, this was a secret decision behind the scenes. There are a number of reasons why now, this time, the Security Council does have to listen to this public debate and to the pressure of the General Assembly.
All right. Mr. Rebus, it seems that Professor Krasno is thinking more of the world is flat than you do in terms of your analysis of the geopolitics at the selection of Secretary General. Mr. Rebus, your comments here.
Well, Let me tell you one thing. The UN is due for openness and reform for a long time. I remember when I was covering the UN General Assembly in 1995, at the 50th anniversary of the United Nations, there was a big movement for reform, for more openness, for a greater inclusiveness, and none of that has happened. So I'm not saying this process is not good. I'm saying this process is good. But this is a consultation, and I think the professor is right to the extent that the Security Council cannot openly ignore everything that is going to happen in these hearings. I think yesterday, for instance, that Antonio Guterres, the former UNHCR commissioner, was very good, but we will also see that probably Ellen Clark is also going to be formidable. So in these candidates, we'll have the opportunity to influence the public opinion. But at the end of the day, I think that that is not going to be the main factor for the United States, China, Russia, France, and the UK to decide whether or not they're going to accept that candidate and to decide who they're going to veto and who they're going to choose. Usually, they want someone from a small neutral country because then the Secretary General is not going to be seen as favoring one of the five powers who are the permanent members. And so the permanent members will have to give some power to the public opinion. They will have to take heed of what's going to happen. It's already happening at these hearings, but I don't think that these hearings will provide the final word unless, there can be some unforeseen circumstance. You can have suddenly a big superpower all over the world coming out, I mean a big superstar coming from these hearings all over the world. That may happen, but barring that, barring a big superstar, born like, out of a singing contest or China's Got Talent. I don't know if you have that over there.
Oh my God.
I don't think that's going to be the main determination.
Well, it sounds so entertaining. I really hope your answer will continue, but I have to drag all of you back to another important question, which is, you talk about the conditions of selecting the Secretary General, and also important related to that is what is the nature of a Secretary General. Earlier we heard Helen Clark in an exclusive with us talking about whether her role is a secretary or as a general. That is an interesting question, isn't it? Professor Liu, what do you make of it? The nature of Secretary General in today's United Nations, if you look at the track records of the past two Secretary Generals.
Well, by official definition, is Chief Administrative Officer. So, Chief Administrative Officer, his responsibility is defined actually in a very broad but very murky role. So therefore, in which they can either choose to play a more proactive role or play a more bureaucratic role. So. They also, are ironically, say, errand boys to service all the UN functions, and of course they manage all the HR. And one very important job is to raise funds. So I think now the position is very demanding. Given the world situation, because there are so many more increased expectations on the performance of the General Secretary.
That is very true. Professor Krasno, though, given all the crisis that's happening, the questions also included in the public hearing toward all of these candidates about the immigration crisis in Europe, about some of the human rights issues around the world, about the wars, about civil wars, and also about health issue, about cultural protection. All of these are big topics, but what exactly should be the role of a Secretary General? I want to come back to you once again with that very important question.
Okay, thank you very much. I think one of the big roles that a Secretary General can play is to use that position as a world leader to bring attention to crucial issues like human rights, the suffering of the poor, the suffering of victims like refugees. And one of the reasons that we're advocating for a woman, not simply because of gender issues, but because if we feel that the Secretary General would represent the interests of a particular region, why don't we think that a Secretary General would be represent the interests of half the world's population, women, And when we look at the suffering of victims within earthquakes, climate change, refugees flowing around the world, it's women who are bearing the brunt of these situations, and they need someone to give them a voice.
We got your point, Professor Krasno. I think it's very important. Gender issues should be debated here. But on the other hand, what about my question? Is that more of a role of a secretary, or is that more of a role of a general? When it comes to the work of Secretary General, vis-a-vis the powers of the Security Council 5 permanent members?
Well, of course, anything having to do with the reform of the Security Council and those kinds of issues, that's up to the member states. The Secretary General may be able to facilitate discussions, but certainly can't make a decision on that. But in terms of managing the Secretariat, there are important things that a Secretary General can do. For example, we all know that prevention is better than trying to enter in after a conflict has erupted. So the Secretary General does have the ability to work on issues of prevention by how she or he organizes the different departments and what assets can be used on gathering information about conflicts and having mediators available on call to be able to go out to situations. So that is under the control of the Secretary General.
Mr. Rebus, let me come back to you very briefly also for the final question. We've seen the fates of several different Secretary Generals quite varied when it comes to their relations with individual members of the Security Council permanent ones, particularly during war times. For example, during the war in Iraq, there is a huge split of the UN Security Council, so is the UN General Assembly. So what do you make of the critical role of a Secretary General these days? What should be the nature of that job? On the one hand, supported has to be by the 5 members of the permanent ones from the Security Council. On the other hand, have to also keep certain kinds of balance and look for at least the minimum justice of the world.
Well, I would see 2 very important roles, and one builds on what Professor Clark was saying about the refugees. There's just too many refugees in the world, and sometimes people care about them and sometimes people don't. And the Secretary General should be, if I may use the expression, a cheerleader for those who are powerless, for those who suffer the most, because the conflict that affects those people affects everybody else, whether people accept that or not. You can see what happened in Europe with the wave of refugees coming in from the Middle East and other parts of the world. It affects them there. So the Secretary General needs to be able to be a cheerleader, to excite the world leaders and the world public opinion to the causes that affect the most poor and vulnerable amongst everybody else in the world. And also, he needs to be the ultimate diplomat in being able to bridge the differences among the 5 permanent members and so that there's stability and international security. International security cannot be achieved against the big powers. It needs to be achieved in consultation and in common work with the big powers.
All right, final words from you. 1 sentence if you can, Professor Liu.
I think that the one important job of the Secretary General is really to ring the bell, in his opinion, to the whole world issues that might be ignored, like the humanity issue and many other important issues, to the attention of the General Assembly.
Thank you so much. Liu Baocheng here in Beijing, Jean Krasno in New York, and Luis Costa Riba with us from Boston. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Stay with us here on World Insight. We got our final segment coming right up. A long-term plan for Chinese soccer. The country's leadership announces its goal of making China a world-class soccer contender by the year 2050. Is it realistic, though? Welcome back. You're watching World Insight on CCTV News. And now let's go to the football pitch. This Monday, the Chinese government issued a blueprint for Chinese soccer reform. It's the first ever reform jointly issued by the top economic planning body, the National Development and Reform Commission. The plan focuses on grassroots soccer, beginning with a 4-tier school league to promote the sport among youngsters. The goal of the reform is to make China among the world's elite soccer nations.
A roadmap to the World Cup. China's NDRC on Monday issued a mid- and long-term development plan for Chinese soccer. It could be the first step of China progressing into a new stage on the global football landscape.
The mid- and long-term development plan comes down in a continuous line with the overall reform plan. The new plan gives more details, including goals to achieve by 2020, 2030, and 2050. It is a satisfying blueprint.
In March 2015, the Chinese government released the overall plan to boost the development of soccer in China. The semi-administrative China Football Association terminated its affiliation with the General Administration of Sport of China last August. That shift marked the full marketization of China's soccer industry. According to the new blueprint, the sport's growth will go through 3 phases. Firstly, a foundation for the sport should be laid by 2020. If all goes according to plan, the number of schools with a specialty in soccer will reach 20,000, and there will be over 30 million primary and middle school students who often play soccer. The second phase is expected to take place between 2021 and 2030. The national men's team will rise to the top in Asia, and China's women's team will be among the world's leading women's teams. In the third phase that spans the next 20 years, China will go all out to realize the goals of being the top soccer nation and all-round development of Chinese soccer. This football reform plan coincides with the national team reaching the final stage of qualifying for the 2018 World Cup in Russia. Guangzhou Evergrande's playmaker Huang Bowen opened the scoring in the 58th minute, and Wu Lei scored 1 goal in the second half. The 2 goals helped China carve out the important 3 points needed to progress towards Russia.
I have to say that China's national men's team has some strength. After over 20 years of development, the national team has made some progress in strategy and ideas. This victory is only a normal play. I hope the team could have a better performance in the future.
The draw for the last phase of the road to Russia took place in Kuala Lumpur on Wednesday. China got drawn in a group with the higher-ranked teams alongside Iran, South Korea, Uzbekistan, Qatar, and Syria. The Chinese team faces huge challenges in its goal to go to Russia, and China's path to being a top-class soccer nation seems even longer.
China become a soccer superpower? Well, at least that's the plan in 50 years. For more on the Chinese soccer, we are joined here in the Beijing studio, Mr. Yan Qiang, founder of the Score Sport. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
And also joining us from London, we have Mr. Mihir Bose, who is a former BBC sports editor. Good to have you as well, sir. So, Mr. Yan, a lot of people are very excited about the news that China will become a soccer superpower. At least that's the phrase being used by the year 2050. But how realistic is it, especially by the year 2020 to 2030, China should be among the top already in Asia? How far away from there?
Yeah, we're still ages away from that, and I'm not sure whether we can reach that target in 34 years' time.
How come you're so pessimistic?
2050. Because I haven't seen any progress or improvements in the real
plan has
overall
just been drawn.
reform. No. We've issued an overall reform plan on March 2015. And in 13 months' time, we issued this kind of middle-term and long-term planning. And there is nothing new in this.
What do you mean by nothing new? Let me go to some of the details. So we're going to establish 20,000 different kinds of sports.
That's all targets, all figures.
Infrastructures.
Yeah.
Remember in previous programs, you were talking about the lack of infrastructure, therefore, as a limitation for Chinese youngsters to participate in the community sports, including soccer. And now we're building it. How come you are saying we're still so far from it?
That was the program that we were having on 1 year ago, after the issue of the overall planning. But in the past year, we really need to see some actual execution of all this reform. And all these key points have been already pointed out 13 months ago. What we have seen for the past 13 months? I've seen no progress in the reform of CFA. I think that's the initial step we have to take.
20,000 match grounds and 70,000 pitches in places of cities by the year 2020. That's the number.
It's more or less been covered in the overall plan 13 months ago.
All right, you are arguing that nothing significant at least has been happening. Let me go to you, Mr. Bose. Of course, you would not be able to help us understand as to how many pitches have been built in China because you have to be here in order to do that. But what do you make of the plan, at least to start from infrastructure? How realistic is it? I mean, China has been really an infrastructure big nation, so it's natural that China is taking this road, but will it work when it comes to soccer?
Well, the problem here is that this is a top-down approach. It's not a bottom-up approach. If you really want to develop a sport, it has to be played at the grassroots level. Now, the figures you've given, the plans you've given sound impressive. Your expert said, the same plans were put forward a year and, nothing has happened since then. But you've got to realize another thing. What is the culture of the people? Do they actually play soccer? Do you go around the streets of China and see people kicking a ball? I'm told you don't.
Well, let me ask you this, Mr. Bowles. How can you cultivate a culture? Where would you start with?
Well, you see, that takes time. America is a very good example. I'm told that the Chinese plan envisages having college sport, a campus where sport will be played and so on. America has college sport. America has also had, for a long time, what are called soccer moms, young people playing soccer. That has not made America a big soccer nation. I covered the World Cup in '94. It was amazing. O.J. Simpson, a certain O.J. Simpson who was accused of murdering his wife, he was acquitted of that. Was bigger news than the football. But a lot of young people play football. A lot of Americans are now playing overseas. We still have to see that development. Now, whether these plans will lead to that development, you would be in a better position to know. My feeling about sporting development happens on two accounts. First of all, a lot of people want to play it. And secondly, the people there, the people of the country, find a few role models to inspire them.
Yeah.
And I think at this stage in China, neither of those two criteria look like being met.
Well, why not? I mean, let me come back to you, Mr. Yan. You shed some light for us here. People want to play. Why not? I mean, you heard enormous amount of big pools of Chinese soccer fans, including parents, talking about we need to have better soccer in our country.
Yeah, we're talking about audiences.
Will be the next generation, it seems.
Yeah, we're talking about audience, but we need the real participants in these sport, and there are so many hindrances, unseen hindrances, especially in schools.
What do you mean by hindrance?
If we go to any middle school, most of middle school now in Beijing or in other capital cities, you would see always the empty pitches. It's a football pitch.
How come?
Because kids are not encouraged to play football in school because the teachers are afraid of this kind of one kid from a family. They might be injured, the parents might not be encouraging, and there will not be no future. Just as Mr. Bose mentioned, that you need to have some role models, successful role models. If play professional football could be a more respectful or more wealthy profession, it is already getting more wealthy now.
Role model, do you have to get your national role model, or you can get role models everywhere? I mean, after all, in the last winter season, China spent $300 million getting some of the best players into China's Super League in a way. That's a lot of money. And that's a lot of role models, I have to say, running on the ground. So aren't there enough role models?
I'm not sure that's the exact role models
what
that
kind
we
of role
would
models should we have then?
We need to have some local heroes. We need to have some decent international player who could be helpful, contribute to the success of the national team.
There are already Chinese players going to international clubs and playing overseas.
Not anymore. Not for the past 10 years. We're talking about Zhang Jihai, who played in Man City as the most successful overseas player of Chinese international. So there are so many hindrances, and I think all these barriers we have to break through. We have to encourage all the schools to open their gate, open their pitch, for the kids to play, to enjoy the game first.
But how that can be done?
It's a very, very hard question, and I haven't seen any progress for the past year. I think it's not something that only through the encouragement of the government that we could change this. It's a cultural challenge.
Mr. Bowles, of course, you're coming from a very different soccer nation compared to China. Culture already existed in your country in terms of people active participation of soccer. But from your perspective, when you see experiences of other countries as well, remember, Mr. Bowles, now China rank about 81st position in terms of FIFA's list as to how strong the country's soccer is, next to Jordan, something like that. So when you look...
You mean Michael Jordan?
Rather the country of Jordan itself, even though China's basketball is another big topic we can talk about, but we'll leave it for another occasion. So let me come back to you, Mr. Bowles. For all of those in front of the 81st position in FIFA's list, what can China learn from these countries? Not every country is having a soccer culture to begin with.
No, but you see, soccer is an international game. You know, everybody knows who Lionel Messi is. You don't have to explain even. You don't have to know a word of Spanish to understand how great a player Lionel Messi is. But you know, your guest there, your expert there, spoke about the culture. You see, there's a whole question about family culture. How do the families, do they encourage Chinese kids to play? Because what we read about young kids from China is how good they are in mathematics, how good they are in the sciences, how good they top the table. You know, I think the parents, and this is a common thing with Asian parents even here, you know, they say, my son the doctor, my son the engineer. They don't say, my son the next Lionel Messi. You see, unless you get to that stage, then of course you need equipment, of course you need playing facilities, but of course also you need the teachers to be able to, there should be teachers to take the kids every day to become soccer players, take time, they take dedication, they take a bit of energy, they take a bit of all-round thinking.
Well, Mr. Bowles, what you are suggesting is really complicated, I have to say. It takes such a whole change of the culture. Mr. Yan, you are laughing here, you know this better than I do.
No,
China
I don't.
doesn't have soccer
I
mom.
don't.
China doesn't have soccer mom, but we have tiger moms, right?
Yep.
To ask the kids to be very diligent and also follow the academic work. The achievements at the academic fields is the best pride of the whole family, not necessarily about sports. So that's a whole culture we're talking about. But yet, under that culture, we see some competitions, some categories are doing really well, while others, such as soccer, not necessarily so. So how should we explain this phenomenon?
It's very difficult to explain, you know, because sport is not in the really cultural tradition of China. So we are not here simply to promote football. We're here to promote sport, and especially collective team sport. You know, from certain perspective, I would say sport could be the best way of education, especially for the young generations in China. We're talking about a lot of academic pressure, a lot of homeworks for them to finish. But football or sport could be a better way to help them to release the pressure from all these academical works. I think this could be a better way of solution.
But Mr. Yan, let's just be realistic here. You've got a whole nation really looking at the soccer pitches as to where China is going from here. And the state leaders today are extremely interested in sports as well. So you got these extreme interests in and attention in the sport. But having said that, though, it's impossible to have it turned overnight.
It's impossible.
But can we have a great leap forward, quote unquote, at least cultivated by, let's just say, enormous amount of investment, enormous amount of public attention, and try to, in a way, cultivate as much as possible in the public debate from today's program even. Let's just make it different. Is that likely to happen?
Yeah. If we focus on individual, if we can focus on all individual kids, if we focus on people, just to encourage the kids to participate, to play football, have fun, that could be the best initiation. Pitches are important, but not that important. I mean, having more kids playing football for 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours per week, to get them out there on the pitch, to sweat, to enjoy the competition, to enjoy the natural, happiness of sport and football. That's going to be the best way out.
Wow, your description already make me very excited, even only as a soccer fan.
You should run back home tonight.
That's right. Not necessarily. I'll tell my nephew to do that. But let me come back to you, Mr. Bowles, before we go. final advice from you, where to go from here, particularly with China's national team and also the professional league, all under very close scrutiny right now in public?
Well, I mean, the professional league in China should be careful not to just import foreign players, you know, sort of slightly over the top foreign players and spend a lot of money, because that will not actually encourage the growth of domestic football. And the other thing I would say, China has had so many great men, perhaps some Chinese scholar could go through the sayings of Confucius and find something which said that you should play football, and that will be the sign of nobility. Maybe there is a saying, he said it at some stage, who knows? I mean, after all, China says it invented football, so Confucius must have said something about football. I would urge the Chinese historians to look into that.
Okay, wow, Mr. Bose, a lot of homework from you to go into the ancient books and look for quotes coming from Confucius about soccer, and from you, Mr. Yan, running back home at least to speed up.
Running back home with the ball.
All right, Yan Qiang here
Midnight in Beijing.
Yan Qiang here in Beijing, and also Mr. Bose he is a former BBC sports editor, now joining us from London. Really appreciate, gentlemen, for being with us. You find a quote for us, maybe, also. Thank you. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of our program, visit our website. Just type in World Insight CCTV News into your search engine. You'll be able to find us, or you can also check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone at the World Insight team, thanks for watching. And tune in again tomorrow for more insights from across China and around the world.